Good morning. It is my absolute delight to welcome Dr. Lamont Colucci, author of the United States Space Force, Space, Grand Strategy, and U.S. National Security to the NSSI here in Colorado. Welcome and thank you for taking the time to talk to our faculty and our students as part of our speaker series, and for joining me here today for our Fireside chat to share some of the insight you've already given us in person with our wider space community.
Thank you very much for having me today. It's been great.
The premise of your book is that to enable American supremacy, the US needs to build out its strategy from 5 to 50 years and beyond, and with greater breadth than the terrestrial realm. Can you tell us why you wrote this book?
Yeah, I think the purpose of the book is trying to integrate these different ideas. So you have the science and the technology people doing their thing, and you have the military people focused more on hard power. And the diplomacy community is focused on relations between other nations. And we have the political class. And so from my perspective, we have to integrate all of these ideas into grand strategy, which is actually what grand strategy is. So since space, and the premise of the book is that space will be the ultimate decider of which powers are on top in the future into the 21st and 22nd century. If that premise is true, then we need a grand strategy that pivots towards that need, and creating that grand strategy for space will also be the grand strategy for the United States and its allies on Earth. So when we look at space, we can't just focus on one aspect, whether it be science or hard power or whatever else. It's economics, it's culture, it's politics, it's diplomacy, it's military power, and how those all are integrated to create a grand strategy that the United States and its allies can follow, which also promotes democratic values and the democratic order that has essentially ruled the world positively since the end of the Second World War.
Can you tell us what key lessons you wish to convey in this book?
I think there's probably a lot of lessons, but my greatest fear is that we have seen throughout history when governments and their militaries fail to appreciate the shifts in whether it be technological or economic or even culturally, and they fail to then be on the front end of that. So, in the book, I mentioned things like the idea of a fixed fortification, but then gunpowder creates a nullifying effect of that. Yet that didn't stop hundreds of years of casualties and death as a result of that. It could have been the English longbow as another example. The French and the Maginot Line in the Second World War. The failure to appreciate the future technologies, economic and science reformations and changes will always lead to problems for the power that doesn't appreciate those. And if we look at our own space history since the 1940s and 50s, we have a lot of failures, right? I talk in the book about the ICBM program, the lunar base program, the nuclear propulsion program, Project Orion. Had any of these been done, so far we would be so far ahead than we are today. So one of the lessons, I think, is myopic thinking, narrow-minded thinking, kind of going along the way we've always been going, is going to create failure. And from my perspective now, speaking more on the international relations side of the equation, the United States has had difficulty in achieving a lot of strategic successes, even when it prevails on the military side of a conflict.
You talk about different levels of space strategy, focusing on nationalistic strength, scientific understanding, and subsequently human survival. How do you think the US should build this into its grand strategy? And is this feasible to achieve within the current political construct?
Well, your second part of your question is I'll address first. I mean, all of the Western powers, and I can't think of really any exceptions, are for the most part linked and obsessed with their own internal concerns. And some of that is justifiable, right? Primarily economic concerns, probably also cultural concerns. If we allow ourselves to be engulfed by that presentism, right, that present conflict, those present fires, we are never going to look into the future. You know, what I hear from a lot of people in the military is it's about the fight tonight, the threat we have right now, and there's truth to that. There is a threat right now, and there's a need to be focused on that. But if your answer to me always is that we have a fire to fight, my answer always is there will always be a fire to fight. And you will always be behind the curve instead of ahead of the curve if you always are answering the question that it's about the here and now. So you have to be very careful. Now, General Shaw talks about this dual mandate. And the dual mandate for the Space Force is that, on the one hand, we are focused on the terrestrial fight today. And we are primarily going to play a supporting role to the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, and the Air Force. True. The second part of that mandate is the celestial mandate, where we need to go beyond geo, cislunar, and beyond. And in that realm, it'll be the reverse situation, where the other services are probably playing the supporting role to the Space Force. Now, some people would argue that you have to make a choice. I think that's a false dilemma. I think you can't have one without the other. I think there's a synthesis between the terrestrial and the celestial, and the need to constantly look at how they feed each other and they enhance each other. And I think that's the only way that the United States and its allies can achieve success in the terrestrial realm, is if we focus on both of them in a parallel at the same time.
Alliances are heavily referenced in U.S. space strategy and policy, and you talk about them within your book. Yet your book suggests that the current paradigm isn't necessarily fit for purpose. Can you explain how you think the U.S. alliances need to evolve, and how do you see the U.S. facilitating this?
So we have a lot of these wonderful alliance structures that are primarily a product of the early years of the Cold War. Whether it be the Mutual Security Treaty with Japan or South Korea, whether it be NATO or ANZUS and things of that nature. The special relationship with Great Britain is, of course, even more unique. The special relationship with Israel is also unique. Then there's kind of de facto alliances, such as with Taiwan. But those are almost entirely, except for one or two, regionally based. In the case of NATO, it's a hybrid between a thematic and a regional alliance. But none of those are going to be able to address what we go beyond Earth. So what I argue in the book is we need to develop a new alliance structure that deals with the grand strategy of the alliance as we move out, which includes economic and political and military and everything else. And then the second part is, I think we have to be extremely careful about the membership of that alliance. My perspective is that those should be reserved for democratic countries alone. Now, if other countries that have different political systems are on occasion and the same in sync with this alliance, that's fine and that's great. But you know, there's this interesting debate in international relations, and it was exemplified by Secretary of Defense Cheney, who later on became Vice President of the United States, and I believe also Don Rumsfeld at the time of the Bush administration, where you have to decide, does the coalition create the mission, or the alliance system create the mission, or does the mission and then the alliance partners join that mission? It's pretty much a night and day decision. Now, I would argue that you always want to have your parameters of the mission, and then the alliance partners that want to join that, they can fit that. But the minute you start saying that the alliance in itself or the coalition determine the mission, then you kind of lose whatever you were trying to do to begin with. So although I think we have many alliance structures that are very valuable and are necessary, but I think the other problem I also have with it is we seem to have an ad hoc approach to this, right? So we're including South Korea and Japan on one type of conversation. We're including our European partners with another kind of conversation, and Australia with another. I mean, it's kind of an almost impossible tangle work. And so I would like to see a much more unified strategy with that. But we can't do this alone. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, we need our alliance partners to not just be responsible, but to be stakeholders and to promote the alliance in general, and obviously share the burden along with that.
It sounds like you're suggesting breaking down some of the current constructs and then rebuilding something different. How feasible and appealing do you think that will be to the wider community to abandon what they already know and are already building on to shift to this new paradigm?
Well, I think that if there is resistance, it's premised on the attitude that those alliance systems have been, in general, successful. I think that is at best a challenging remark. If you simply just take a snapshot of the Ukraine situation, or if you want to use Afghanistan, or if you want to use Iraq, you can see the severe severings and tensions within those alliance structures that caused and have caused and continue to cause challenges and even in some cases potential failures. And part of that is this idea that if we don't adopt every aspect of what every coalition partner wants, that somehow we have engaged in some type of diplomatic offense. So yes, I think some of these alliance systems have been very successful for the time in which they were created. But for example, if I would probably make the argument that of all the alliance systems, NATO has been the most successful one. However, NATO is currently engaged in an identity crisis that they've never solved. It started in 1991, and here we are, and NATO has yet to resolve that identity crisis. In other words, now that the Soviet Union has disappeared, and although now we have this kind of blip of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, what really is the goal of NATO? Is it simply an alliance that is to prevent primarily Russian aggression, although Article 5 was only utilized within Afghanistan? Or should it be something greater than that? And so you have all these discussions about reform and ideas of what NATO should look like, and which, and of course France poses some unique, challenges regarding the political and the military structure, and they have in the past as well. But so here we have the most successful alliance, which I argue is still going through an identity crisis. There's been some more solidification because of the Ukraine issue, but we have to then, if you're looking at grand strategy or even just strategy in general, you have to look beyond that. So once whatever occurs in Ukraine is settled, in whatever way it is settled, then are we back to the discussion of this identity crisis? So I think we should be forward-looking in how to deal with that now, as an example.
Thank you. Can you elaborate more on what you mean when you say that the ultimate goal is not space, but American supremacy?
Sure. So I speak a lot in different venues among different crowds, and a good segment of people involved in space are perhaps rightfully in their own minds obsessed with space. Okay, that seems to be normal. But for me, and the way I look at it is, space is simply another domain. And I think my fear that there are members of the space professional community, inside and outside government, inside and outside of private sector, where the goal is simply space. In other words, maybe it's space exploration, maybe it's space economics. But if you look at it from a national security perspective, in this case, from an American national security perspective, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this to enhance the prosperity and the success of the United States. So space is simply a domain that we can be successful in, that we should utilize, but not for itself, not for the sake of itself. I mean, American foreign policy, and I talked about this in my presentation. We have focused intensely on the issues like human rights and democracy promotion and human dignity. And if we forget that component of it, then I don't know what we're doing, right? And then we're no different than any of the other great powers that wish to venture off into space.
Is this tied to your analogy of brown, green, blue water thinking, and then progressing to, I think you referred to it as black space thinking, and how that should start to shape the US and maybe its coalition's intent with the space domain?
Yeah. So, the debate in the Navy, or I should say in what people sometimes refer to as the maritime environment, is, brown water, which is this kind of limited inlets and waterways and rivers, and then green water, the coasts, and maybe a little bit beyond, and blue water, the globe. And so you end up having these same factions that have developed in space, right? So the blue water space people criticize the others for being too constrained, right? You just care about satellites. You only care about, LEO and GEO. And we're trying to go beyond the cislunar, Mars, and beyond. And I think that the use of that is fine. I do think there's a lot of baggage, and people can get really irritated because if the blue water person is calling another person the brown water, I mean, you're already creating a negative argument. So, in the book, I say maybe we jettison the three colors. We call it black, and maybe we say black water or black space, because we shouldn't be anchored in some of that very terrestrial thinking when this is such a different environment in all ways. But I would also argue that for the purpose of the success of the alliance and for the United States, if you want to use blue water thinking, it probably is the only way to achieve success. In other words, we need to break out of the bonds and go well beyond ex-geo in our thinking. I was talking to a group this morning, and there was a discussion among members of the Army about what do they plan to do in space, not just supporting, but actually do they have plans to be in space? And you end up having discussion that if companies like Blue Origin or SpaceX are even remotely correct in their timetables, which we can't predict, but of when they want large human presence on the moon and Mars, then we are going to be confronted in a relatively short period of time with addressing that kind of concern. How is that governed? Who is protecting those people? What if those people are in trouble? What if there's a crisis of some kind, either man-made or environmentally created? I mean, there's a host of very basic questions that almost write themselves. And either we start thinking about that now, or we will be in a reactive mode, which is never good because in crisis decision-making is always worse than any other type of decision-making. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to start adopting now. And with people, claim that science fiction, that they're really not paying attention to what's going on with these large entrepreneurial ventures. Starship is getting a lot of attention, but we could use that. I mean, Starship is going to be such a game changer when it's successful, and it's going to be a game changer not just in the celestial but in the terrestrial as well. So the attitude that this is some kind of futuristic, we can't deal with it, that's very myopic, and so that I think is a very big danger. Yeah.
It sounds like you're suggesting that commercial is going to play a leading role in how space progresses and how the US and the coalition, probably, all countries who've got spacefaring capabilities are going to be shaped in their economy, in their geopolitical stance. With commercial players having such significant impact and perhaps an expectation that the US government and therefore military will provide that protection and that defense even, do you see going forwards the US government and military therefore having a say in how commercial conducts what it does, such as the placement of assets or the operations that it carries out if it's going to be responsible for those kinds of actions?
Yeah. Oh, I definitely think so. I think there has to be a constant give and take between the private sector and allied governments. If they are truly successful in asteroid mining, in the exploitation of space resources, in human settlement, in setting up vast networks of trade and transport, just to name those four, then there has to be rules of the road, right? And there has to be norms, right? We talk about international law in space. And those companies have to be responsible stakeholders. Equally, the allied governments need to recognize that those commercial enterprises could very well outpace our thinking, our strategy, and our doctrine unless we pivot right now to be ahead of that curve. So that has to be a synthesis. I don't think we want a repeat of the Wild West. A lot of people say that the Klondike Gold Rush will be what it looks like. I don't think we want to repeat that necessarily. But there are other historical analogies, like perhaps the Space Force operates in the sense of a cavalry, where they can't be everywhere at all times, just as we could not be everywhere at all times in the West. But they serve as a force of stability, a force to deal with very serious crises, and create some type of sense of law and order and stability for both those that were pioneers, those who were engaged in commerce and the railroad and everything else. So I think that's necessary, and the Allied governments need to bring in their commercial space into those discussions, and those discussions should be a synthesis with each other. Yeah.
What key risks do you think the US is not currently considering, whether that be within the commercial sector, government, or within the military construct, that if overlooked and not necessarily planned for, could lead to the US not being in that supremacy position that it hopes and intends to be in?
I think, and I'm sure there are people, there are obviously people looking at all of these risks. So the question is, are people that are looking at these risks getting enough resources and authority to deal with them? I think there's many. One of which would be, are we truly prepared for adversarial actions, be it China, be it Russia, be it non-state actors that will be very difficult to attribute their actions? What are we prepared to do if they interfere with the free navigation of space? What if they interfere with business and commercial activity in space? What if they try to prevent free navigation or trade in space? What if they simply declare areas of, whether it be the moon or wherever, their domain? And they could do that even within the context of the Outer Space Treaty with saying it's a research station. Or they could simply say, we don't really care about the Outer Space Treaty, we're just going to declare sovereignty. We know open source what Chinese doctrine says out to about 100 years. Dominate cislunar, dominate the moon, dominate Mars, and then dominate the solar system. They have kind of an elaborate timeline. Whether they meet all of those goals, I'm not sure is as important as the fact that such a timeline exists, with clearly demonstrates intent and motivation. So my question is, are we truly prepared to be in a non-reactive mode to those types of actions, to address those now? And so those risks are aplenty. And direct energy weapons, the Chinese declaring some idea of putting missiles in orbit to supposedly defend against asteroids, the establishment of a Chinese-Russian lunar base, all of these things, they're going to happen. The question is, are we going to be again on the front end of that or at the back end of that? Yeah.
Your book has a lot of historical references. What lessons do you think we should be taking from history to try to prevent some of this that you talk about?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I think that many of the problems and challenges the Space Force in particular will face will actually be much more reminiscent of the 16 and 1700s than they are of recent history. We have not had to address those type of problems since that period in human history, whether that be about colonies and settlements, whether that be about discovery, whether that be about resources in areas that there is no human presence or government, whether that is how you deal with exploration, and what happens when a group of people from one part of the world go to another part. In this case, it'll be off-world. What government structure does that look like? Who maintains law and order, and things of that nature? So in that sense, we're almost regressing back into looking at historical models about what worked and what didn't work in that period of time. In the other ways, I think we can look at ways in which societies didn't, as I said, prepare for these advances and these changes in both military, economic, political thinking, and therefore were lost They ended up subsumed into the great powers that did. I mean, the case studies are everywhere, right? I mean, we could talk about the very different, imperial path that Britain took and Spain took. And Spain took a path that was very narrow-minded and myopic and ultimately failed, as one example. So history can't predict the future, but it can provide pathways about what is successful and what doesn't work. And it can be a good warning sign when people will claim that's too out of the box or that's too far out. I think there are, of course, things that are too far out and maybe too out of the box. But I at least think everything should be weighed heavily so that we can avoid making those mistakes that we have made in the past. Yeah.
This has been a really fascinating discussion. What other key points would you like to share with our wider space community?
Yeah, I think that the Space Force is at the leading edge of what we need to accomplish in national security. I think that one of the things that we need to recognize is the importance of Space Force. I talk in my book, and I've talked in various venues, that we need to connect the American people with what is going on. The American people need to understand the importance of space. They need to understand the importance of Space Force. They need to understand why their tax dollars is being used. We talked at the beginning about the political climate, about governments and looking at budgets and economic problems. So there has to be a justification made to the people of the United States, the people of Great Britain or wherever. Why are we involved in this? And how will this benefit the average person? Now that story is easy. In other words, the answers are there. We can talk about jobs, we can talk about prosperity, we can talk about exploration, we can talk about new frontiers. I mean, it's rather endless. We also have to talk about the threat issue. We don't want to scare people to death, but we want to be frank and honest with them that here's what was going to happen if we ignore these things, and there has to be some understanding that there are adversaries out there, state actors, non-state actors, that wish us ill or wish to upend the international order. I mean, China has been very open about that, literally stating, I wish to upend the international order. And so if anything, I'm hoping that people inside and outside of government, but especially in government, including Space Force, recognize that that is a very critical issue that you don't hear people talking about as much. When I've spoken to other conferences, people generally will come up to me and say, of all the things you said, it might have been very interesting, but for some reason that stuck in my mind. And I think it does resonate, because I think there is a need for the democratic governments that are involved in this to have a very frank, open discussion of the good and the bad and the ugly of what is going on and what's going to happen in the future.
How best do you think the democratic governments of the world who need to better convey this message, how do they achieve that?
Well, one would like to see that probably from first the very top. One would like to see, in the context of the United States, people talk about the Kennedy speech, and there was more than one, but there's especially the seminal speech. Whether that has to happen in the next format, I don't know, but it should probably. So you'd like to see that from the top. I think that for Space Force there should be an active participation in that. In other words, we should be asking ourselves, how are we messaging this? How are we recruiting for this? We're talking now about ideas about a National Guard component of Space Force. I actually think that is a fantastic idea for all the regular reasons, but then there's this additional reason of what better way to enhance this role about the importance of space and Space Force than having it bound into each of the 50 states. It's just one example. So I think there's a need, though. I would argue that every Guardian should be part of this. Every Guardian can't convince every person, but they can probably be involved in with various circles, professional and personal circles that they are involved in.
That sounds like it's got a cultural take to it. So with that in mind, how do you think Space Force should build that into Guardian culture going forwards?
Yeah, I would like to see Guardian culture to be much more filled with esprit de corps. I would like to see them understanding that we are a new service and we should adopt a new identity. We clearly understand the majority, especially of the upper officer corps, came from the Air Force. That's fine. But there has to be a recognition that this is a new branch. It should have new thinking. Whatever thinking that existed that was successful in the other services, clearly maintain, including whatever traditions that are upheld. But there also has to be a recognition that as an entirely new branch, there has to be an entirely new thinking because we are an entirely new and different domain. And perhaps more importantly, we'll be expected to do things that no other service will be expected to do for the future.
Dr. Colucci, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you again for taking the time to talk to not just our staff and our faculty and our students within the National Security Space Institute, but also for sharing your thoughts with our wider space community. So thank you once again.
Appreciate it. Thank you.